Hello, how's everybody doing? I'm about to get into the Devariim, the last book of the Torah, of the Chumash. It's also called Deuteronomy, or as my dad would call it, the coolest book in the Bible because it's Deuteronomy. Anyway, so Devariim, well known and well accepted, and obviously there's actually in the verses, which we'll get into, that this is Moses speaking. Like most of the time when Moses is around, and the Torah is recording it, and God said to Moses, and God said to Moses, and God said to Moses. God tells Moses what to say. So Devarim, a lot of it, as we'll see, especially the first verse, which we'll get into, starts with Moses talking. It doesn't say, and God said to Moses. It just says, Moses said. Moses starts talking. Now, this is kind of interesting because thousands of reasons, but I'll just say what my thinking is on this. Judaism teaches that the Torah, that Moses received, that we received the Torah at Sinai, and is a communal. This is one of the arguments, in the Kuzari, which is written in like the 1100s by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that we received the Torah in public. God spoke to people, but God spoke to the whole nation in public. It wasn't just one person. It wasn't in private. It wasn't in a dream. Everybody was there. At least 600,000 people minimum were there, and experienced Har Sinai as it's described in the Torah. That koach of that revelation, the fact that it was public, gives the strength for all the rest of the Torah, and even the sections before Har Sinai, because Moses wasn't there in Bereshit, so Moses wasn't around until he was born, right? So everything that in the Torah is recorded before his birth and until he actually is really introduced. How do we even have the koach to even say that those things were? I mean, Moses wrote those things down and things that he wasn't even there. But God told him what to write. So all the book of Bereshit and all the book before Bereshit, after Bereshit. So everything up until Moses is born and let's say old enough to start writing and started until he even received prophecy, which wasn't much later in his life. So everything that we read in the Torah up until that moment, Moses wrote it down. But he wasn't there at creation. Moses wasn't there at creation. And he wasn't. So my point is we Dati Judaism says that the five books of the Torah were communicated to Moses by God, and so God said it to Moses, and then Moses wrote it down, and then Moses taught it to Yeshua ben Nun, and this is the whole Pirkei Avot, the first Pirkei Avot that gives the Masorah, how it worked, the transmission of our traditions, of our Torah specifically. And it's extremely, extremely important that there's this Masorah, that there's this continuation. But it all hinges on the public revelation of God to Moses, and God giving to Moses that you're going to be the main prophet. And he did that. God did that in front of everybody. That was actually happened with the story in Korach. God chose Moses in front of everybody. Everybody was there when they saw that happen, reestablishing and strengthening Moses' leadership. Now, here we are at the end of Moses' life, and Moses is about to die. Moses is going to die. And now we have his last will and testament, as you might call it, his last, his dreams, his wishes, his thoughts, and everything that we're going to read, or a lot of what we're going to read, is not introduced in God said to Moses. But we still believe that it's as true as all the other previous verses. So that's my little recording, my pre-introduction to Devariim, and it's extremely important that we try to understand the perspective that when a Dati, when a Shomer Shabbat religious Jew reads the Torah. I mean, I can't say what's in everybody's mind, but we're taught at least to believe that these words, every word in the Torah, is God dictating it to Moses, and Moses wrote it down exactly as he heard. He heard it as a clear vessel. It says that God spoke to Moses face to face. And it wasn't in dreams, it wasn't in riddles, it wasn't in parables. It says in the Torah. So when there's verses that are complicated and verses that are difficult and we don't understand them, it's because we don't understand them, but they're supposed to be clear, right? They're not. It's not riddles. It's not in it says in the Torah that there's a verse in the Torah that says that God spoke to Moses clearly without riddles. So why do we need Rashi? Why do we need the commentary? Why do we need Onkelos? Onkelos who lives, 2,000 years, 1,000, more than 1,000 years before Rashi. Why do we need people to help us understand what the Torah says if it's written clearly? Why do we need any commentary, right? The Torah is so clear, but the Torah, so that's like probably a different question for a different time. But really, the Bekitzer answer, the short answer to that, my own question is the Torah is meant to be with an oral tradition. It's meant to give it. There's meant to be an oral explanation of what's going on. You're not, and even Rashi in his commentary says that the Torah often screams out at you, "Explain me, explain me." He says in the first commentary on Bereshit, we want God's like telling you, I'm going to write this in a way that's going to force you to ask questions. You've got to come on. We can't just read these verses and not think. We're supposed to be thinking when we're reading these verses, not just supposed to be just saying them like a robot, right? We're supposed to really connect to them. And even if you don't believe that they were written by God, even if you think that they're written by J.E.P. and D, or you have your whole documentary hypothesis, whatever you think about the Torah, whatever your feelings are about it, it's something supposed to resonate with you. You're supposed to think about it. It's meant to be explored and to be talked about and discussed. It's written specifically like this. It wasn't on accident. So especially if you believe that it was written by J.E.P. and D, that it was a documentary hypothesis, that it was edited. So you'd have to say that those editors wanted us to ask these questions because they edited it in a way to force us to ask these questions. Because otherwise, why would they would have edited it differently? Like we'd have a different text. And we don't have a different text. They found it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the same words we're reading now, and that was written more than 3,000 years ago, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, it's interesting, these people, this whole documentary hypothesis, they themselves have an explanation for the verses. That's their explanation for the verses. So their explanation for the verses that we find and that we have in our tradition that they've uncovered and that they've unearthed in archaeological digs in all these places, the documentary hypothesis is its own explanation of the same verses. Of course, like a Dati Jew, a Shomer Shabbat Jew, really can't exactly accept the documentary hypothesis because we're taught and we're supposed to believe that the Torah was given to Moses Rabbeinu, and Moses Rabbeinu gave it to Yeshua ben Nun, and there's this Masorah. And it was given, and it says, and when God spoke to Moses, saying, that's exactly what God said to Moses. Those exact words that are written, not other words. Now there's explanation of the words. Now here when we get to Devariim, isn't God spoke to Moses anymore? It's Moses speaking. So what does the documentary hypothesis have to say about that? What do they have to say about this last book? Who do they attribute it to? If they said that Moses didn't exist, if they said that it was a made-up character, made-up person to continue on with this Davidic, the Davidic line, they had to the documentary hypothesis, a lot of them, and not all of them agree with each other, of course. But anyways, the main thing is that the whole Torah is a means to an end. And what's the end? To justify the eventual conquest of Canaan by the Hebrew tribes, and to perpetuate this myth of the King David myth, right? So they also don't think King David was a real person. A lot of them. There are maybe a few documentary hypothesis people are really into these theories who think that King David was a real person. But we're putting aside whether or not King David was a real person or not, to get to the fact that Jews believe that he's a real person. So to justify this narrative, we have to accept certain, this whole narrative was created by this J.E.P. and D group, by these groups of people who created the national myth of the Hebrew people, which eventually became the Jews. So this is really, really important to understand, the underlying current of the documentary hypothesis personalities. And again, not all of them. I'm just saying, most of them. Their whole theme, their whole Zeitgeist, their whole is to try to understand like where did the Jewish people come from and why are we so attached to Israel and what's this whole King David thing about and what's the whole thing about king like why do we have this like obsession with the story of Yeshua ben Nun and the conquest? So we created this national story, this national myth story to justify our existence in Israel. That's like one of the underpinning ideas and themes of the documentary hypothesis. Now, the Dati Judaism, kind of sort of agrees with it in a sense, and we say, yeah, Yeshua ben Nun really did exist, and there really was a conquest of Eretz Israel and there really were yeah, we know that there were 7 nations living in Eretz Israel. It's so funny, like they find these archaeological digs, and they're like, oh, and it's proof that there was people who lived in Israel that were like idol worshippers and that ate pigs, and like they find like these different archaeological digs, and it's like people like see like the Canaanite nation, like the Bible says that there was Canaanite nations. The Bible mentions at one point in the Torah that mentions 10 nations, 10 different peoples, up to 10. I mean, I know we famously refer to the 7 Canaanite nations, but there's one pasuk in the Torah where it actually mentions 10 of them. So it always refers to Eretz Canaan. It always refers to it as Eretz Canaan. It never calls it Eretz Israel. Always Eretz Canaan in the Chumash. So I mean, there's so many questions on the whole documentary hypothesis, like crowd and like on their studies and on their books, and it's like I feel like people just accept what they say because they're like academians and they're all PhD holders and they're really extremely smart, well-versed people, and they know Hebrew much better than me, and they know Greek and they know ancient Roman, and like they know like all these languages, and they're really really smart people, and they have they wrote they have doctorates, they're not just like stom random people on the internet, right? So they have they write books and they publish books at 1,000+ pages, and I'm just I just have like really basic questions, which it's interesting that I would think that they would most people just wouldn't would just come naturally, like these questions that get to them or about them should be reasonable. These are reasonable questions I'm asking. And they ask reasonable questions on the Torah, right? Because the Torah is written in a kind of a mysterious way. It is, there are like questions, just open questions on the Torah. And it's okay to ask questions on the Torah. The person who every single Dati Jewish person studies, the first person we generally study is Rashi. This guy, Rashi, right? And he lived in the 1100s and the 1050s, or he lived in the 1050s, right? In the 1000s, in the year 1000, in the 11th century. And everybody studies him in the Dati world. Everybody studies Rashi. And he asks questions. He's trying to understand the Torah, and he's trying to also answer questions that he received from his own community, also from the non-Jewish people that lived around him. Like they would come to him and confront him and ask him questions, and he wrote a commentary trying to answer these questions that he himself maybe had, but they were also questions that he received. So that like he was trying to like answer questions. So asking questions is an essential part of Judaism. All right, so that's enough for this one.